In the spring of 1946, a killer came to Texarkana. He attacked in the dark, always at night, always in isolated places where young couples had parked their cars away from the lights of the city. He left survivors in the early attacks wounded and traumatized, barely alive. And then he stopped leaving survivors at all. He struck 5 times over the course of 10 weeks. He killed 5 people. He wounded 3 others. He sent an entire town of 50,000 people into a state of absolute terror, unlike anything the region had ever experienced. And then, as suddenly and as mysteriously as he had appeared, he stopped. No arrest was ever made. No suspect was ever charged. No identity was ever confirmed. The man the newspapers called the Phantom Killer walked out of the darkness of those Texas and Arkansas nights and was never heard from again. And nearly 80 years later, no one has ever been able to say with certainty who he was, why he killed, or where he went. This is the story of the Texarkana Moonlight Murders. And if you have never heard it before, I promise you, you will not forget it. To understand this case, you first need to understand the place. Texarkana is a unique city in the United States. It sits directly on the border between Texas and Arkansas, and it is essentially 2 cities that share one name. Texarkana, Texas and Texarkana, Arkansas exist side by side, divided by State Line Avenue, a single road that runs directly down the center of the city with Texas on one side and Arkansas on the other. In 1946, Texarkana was a mid-sized southern city with a population of around 50,000 people. It was a railroad hub, a commercial center, a community where people knew their neighbors and left their doors unlocked. It had the particular character of a post-war American town. People coming home from the war, trying to rebuild normal lives, settle down, start families. It was not the kind of place where people expected a monster. The spring of 1946 changed that forever. The first attack happened on the night of February 22nd, 1946. Jimmy Hollis was 24 years old. Mary John Larry was 19. They were parked on a remote road outside of town, a lover's lane spot that local young people used regularly. It was late. It was dark. The road was quiet. A man approached their car. He was wearing a mask. Witnesses would later describe it as a white cloth or sack-like mask with holes cut out for his eyes. He was tall, broad-shouldered. He carried a flashlight and a gun. He ordered Jimmy out of the car. He pistol-whipped him severely, beating him to the ground. He then turned his attention to Mary John. What happened next was brutal and deeply disturbing. She was assaulted. She managed to break free at one point and run. The attacker chased her, struck her, and continued the assault before ultimately leaving both victims alive on that dark road. Jimmy and Mary John survived. They were badly injured, traumatized, and terrified, but they were alive. They described their attacker as a large white male, over 6 feet tall, wearing that distinctive homemade mask. They said he spoke very little. He was deliberate, controlled. He seemed to know exactly what he was doing. Local police investigated, but had very little to go on. There were no fingerprints, no clear physical evidence left at the scene, and the attacker had vanished back into the night as quietly as he had emerged from it. Nobody knew then that this was just the beginning. The second attack came exactly 1 month later. On the night of March 24th, 1946, Richard Griffin and Polly Ann Moore were parked on another remote road outside of Texarkana. Richard was 29, Polly was 17. This time, the Phantom Killer left no survivors. Their bodies were found the following morning. Both had been shot. The crime scene showed signs of a violent struggle. Polly had been moved after her death, her body positioned in a way that suggested the killer had taken his time at the scene. The similarities to the February attack were immediately apparent to investigators. The remote location, the couple parked alone at night, the deliberate, controlled nature of the violence. But now, he had killed. The Texas Rangers were called in. The investigation escalated, but the killer had left almost nothing behind. No fingerprints, no shell casings that could be definitively traced, no witnesses, no vehicle description. He had come, and he had gone, and left nothing but 2 bodies and a community beginning to feel the first edges of fear. 3 weeks later, he struck again. On the night of April 13th, 1946, Paul Martin and Betty Jo Booker were attacked on a remote road outside of Spring Lake Park. Paul was 17. Betty Jo was 15. They had been at a local dance earlier that evening with friends. Sometime after midnight, they drove out together and parked. Paul's body was found the next morning on a road some distance from where they had been parked. He had been shot multiple times. He had apparently tried to run and was shot in the back. Betty Jo's body was found several hours later in a different location, over a mile from where Paul was found. She had been shot twice. Like Polly Ann Moore before her, there were signs that the killer had remained with her body after death. She still had her saxophone with her when she was found. She had been carrying it from the dance. The image of a 15-year-old girl, shot twice, lying in the Arkansas woods with her saxophone beside her, became one of the defining and most heartbreaking details of the Texarkana Moonlight Murders. The city was now in a state of panic. What happened next is something that does not happen often in American history. Texarkana shut down. People stopped going out at night. Movie theaters reported massive drops in attendance. Restaurants emptied after dark. Lovers' lanes that had been popular gathering spots for local young people became completely abandoned. Families who lived in rural areas outside the city moved in with relatives in town. Hardware stores sold out of locks and door bolts. Gun shops reported that they could barely keep firearms in stock. The local newspaper, the Texarkana Gazette, ran regular front-page coverage. The Texas Rangers flooded the area. The FBI became involved. Police set up roadblocks. Undercover officers parked in remote areas at night, posing as couples, hoping to draw the killer out. A local businessman offered a reward of $500 for information leading to the killer's capture. Others added to the reward. It eventually grew to several $1,000s, a substantial sum in 1946. None of it brought the killer out of hiding. He simply waited. The fourth attack came on the night of May 3rd, 1946. Virgil Starks was 36 years old. He was a farmer who lived with his wife Katie on a rural property about 10 miles outside of Texarkana. On that Friday night, Virgil was sitting in his living room reading the newspaper. Katie was in the back of the house, getting ready for bed. The phantom killer approached the farmhouse. He came up to a window. He shot Virgil Starks twice through the window with a rifle. Both shots hit. Virgil died in his chair. Katie heard the shots and came to the front of the house. She saw her husband. She was then shot herself twice through the face. The bullets passed through her cheeks. Somehow, impossibly, she survived. She fled through a back door and ran to a neighbor's house. She was covered in blood, barely able to speak. When law enforcement arrived at the Starks farmhouse, they found evidence that the killer had actually entered the home after shooting through the window. He had walked through the house. He had used the telephone at some point, though to call whom or why was never established. He had left behind a bloody fingerprint. That fingerprint was never matched to any known individual. The Starks attack was different from the others. It was not a remote road. It was not a couple parked at night. It was a farmhouse. A man sitting in his living room. A deliberate, targeted assault on people in their own home. Either the killer was escalating and changing his pattern, or this attack was not connected to the others. That debate has continued for decades. And then he stopped. After the attack on the Starks farm on May 3rd, 1946, the phantom killer was never heard from again. No more attacks. No more bodies. No more crime scenes with that distinctive lack of evidence. No communication. No confession. No deathbed admission. Nothing. He was there, terrorizing Texarkana for 10 weeks. And then he was gone. The investigation continued for months. Law enforcement developed suspects, followed leads, conducted interviews. Hundreds of people were questioned. Multiple individuals were looked at closely as potential suspects. None of it led to a charge. None of it led to a confirmed identification. Over the decades, several names have emerged as serious suspects in the Texarkana Moonlight Murders. I want to walk through the most significant ones. The first and most well-known suspect is a man named Ul Swinney. Swinney was a local criminal with a long history of theft and other offenses. His wife, Peggy Swinney, gave statements to investigators in which she implicated her husband in the murders. Her account was detailed and compelling. She placed him at or near several of the crime scenes. She described his behavior during the period of the attacks in ways that aligned with the timeline. But there was a significant legal problem. In 1946, a wife could not be compelled to testify against her husband in court. Peggy Sweeney's statements, as compelling as they were, could not be used as evidence unless she chose to testify voluntarily. And at trial, she did not. Without her testimony, prosecutors could not make a murder case against U.L. Sweeney. He was eventually convicted on unrelated theft charges and sentenced to life in prison as a habitual criminal. He was paroled in the 1970s. He denied involvement in the murders until his death. He was never charged. The second name that has been raised over the years is that of a traveling criminal who passed through the Texarkana area during the spring of 1946 and had a history of violent offenses in other states. His whereabouts during the specific dates of the attacks were never conclusively established, and investigators at various points considered him a viable suspect. He was never charged and died without any confirmed connection to the case. A third theory, one that gained traction in more recent decades, is that the killer was a local man, someone who knew the roads, someone who knew the Lover's Lane locations, which were not widely publicized but were known by locals, someone who could move through that landscape at night without drawing attention because he belonged there. The specificity of the attack locations, all remote spots that would require local knowledge to find in the dark, combined with the killer's apparent familiarity with the terrain, has led many researchers to believe that the Phantom Killer was not a transient or a traveler, but someone who lived in or very near Texarkana. There is something about this case that sets it apart from many other unsolved murders, and I think it is worth sitting with for a moment. The Phantom Killer was methodical. He was controlled. He wore a mask from the very first attack, which tells us he was thinking about being identified before he ever committed his first crime. He left almost no physical evidence at any of the scenes. He chose locations that gave him maximum darkness and minimum witness exposure. And when law enforcement flooded the area with officers and unmarked cars and roadblocks, he simply stopped. He had the discipline to stop. That is not the behavior of someone acting on pure impulse. That is the behavior of someone capable of controlling themselves, of assessing risk, of making calculated decisions. He understood that the heat was too high, and he went cold. That level of control is chilling, and it may be part of why he was never caught. A killer who can simply decide to stop, and then stop, leaves investigators with no trail to follow. In 1976, a film was made about the Texarkana Moonlight Murders. It was called The Town That Dreaded Sundown. It was presented in a semi-documentary style, dramatizing the attacks and the investigation. It was a significant commercial success and introduced the case to a national audience. The film was remade in 2014. A sequel of sorts was released, also using the Texarkana murders as its backdrop. But the attention brought by those films and by decades of true crime, coverage, journalism, and investigation has still not produced the one thing that the people of Texarkana and the families of the victims have always wanted: a name, a confirmed identity, an answer. The victims of the Texarkana Moonlight Murders were real people. Jimmy Hollis survived and lived with the physical and psychological wounds of that February night for the rest of his life. Mary Jeanne Larry survived and carried the trauma of what was done to her in that dark road in a way that no one who has not experienced it can fully understand. Richard Griffin and Polly-Ann Moore did not make it home. Paul Martin and Betty Jo Booker, 17 and 15 years old, did not make it home. Betty Jo still had her saxophone. Virgil Starks did not make it home. Katie Starks survived 2 gunshot wounds to her face and had to live with the memory of what she found in that living room for the rest of her life. These were not abstractions. These were people with families, with futures, with names that deserve to be spoken. The Texarkana Moonlight Murders case is technically still open. As of today, no one has ever been officially charged. The bloody fingerprint found at the Starks farmhouse was never matched. The mask was never found. The weapon was never recovered. Ewell Sweeney went to his grave denying everything. And somewhere out there, in the possibility that the killer was a local man who lived a long and ordinary life after 10 weeks of terror in 1946, there is the deeply unsettling idea that he may have sat in church with the people he terrorized, shopped at the same stores, walked the same streets of Texarkana for decades after the attack stopped. Known to everyone, known to no one. Leave your theories in the comments. Who do you think the Phantom Killer was? Do you think it was U.L. Swinney? Do you think he was a local man who lived among his victims for decades? Do you think the Starks attack was connected or a separate crime entirely? Tell me what you think. If this one kept you up tonight, you know what to do. Subscribe to the Unsolved Vault. New case every Tuesday and Friday. Next time, we are going to Philadelphia. 1957. A little boy found in a cardboard box on the side of a road. No name, no identity, no one who came forward to claim him. For 65 years, he was known only as the boy in the box. That story is coming Tuesday, and I will warn you right now, it is one of the most heartbreaking cases we have ever covered. You will want to be here for it.